This is the hole as it appears after drilling and rough milling out to size. We're going to set up a dial bore gauge to the 1 3/4 diameter. And this is the chart that comes with most bore gauge sets. And if we look closer at the next image, we see we want 1 3/4. We're going to need the number 3 tip with no shim under the tip. So we're going to go to the gauge, gauges set, and pick the number 3 tip. This is a Mitutoyo dial bore gauge. Reads in tenths of thousandths. I don't know if you can see that number 3 on there. And we're going to set up our gauge block stack. The 1-inch gauge block there, and the 3/4 inch gauge block here, and 2 end pieces and a screw to hold them together. We need to ring the gauge blocks together. When you ring gauge blocks together, the actual surface tension of the slight film of oil on the gauge block holds the gauge blocks together if you've rung them together correctly. So that, see how I'm holding it and it doesn't fall off? You of course have to make sure that the gauge faces are clean before you do that, or else you don't want to scratch the faces. But see, the surface tension actually holds the blocks together, and if they don't stay together like that, you haven't rung them together correctly, and you need to do it again, basically. And so see how they won't fall apart, but the dial bore gauge spring is too strong and it would pop them apart, so we got to put a screw to hold them together. You can I like square gauge blocks like this, but you can also do the same thing with rectangular gauge blocks. You just need there's a little clamping set that goes with it that will hold the gauge blocks together. Now we're going to put the number 3 tip in the bore gauge without the shim, as you remember from the chart. So I don't know if you can see that number 3, maybe. And then we're going to set the dial indicator on the other end of the gauge to the correct amount. I like to set my indicator with the small needle at 1 and the large needle at 0 when it's reading the nominal size of the gauge block set. Some people like to set these things like halfway on the travel of the dial bore gauge, but in reality that's not too good, because then you run out of travel if the bore is too small. So here you have to rock the gauge back and forth in the gauge block set. You loosen the clamp on the indicator and just give it a little bit of tension so you can move it up and down until you get your 0 in the place you want it. I like the needle to stick straight back like that, or straight up like that on my gauge block, my dial bore gauge. That isn't essential, but I kind of like it. It just is easier for me to read. So I get it like that, and then 0 the dial to 0. Now, in order to do this correctly, you have to rock the dial bore gauge back and forth in both directions. You're trying to get the minimum reading on the dial indicator at your 0 point. So in the next little sequence of images, I kind of try to demonstrate that here by rocking it back and forth in both directions. So you get the minimum reading in one direction, and then you rock it back and forth the other direction and try to get the minimum reading the other way, so that you have the minimum reading, total minimum reading, I guess you call it, in both directions. And that's where you want your 0 to be. So you've read the size of the stack of gauge blocks in this case. I rotate it a little bit there so you can see I'm moving it. I'm rotating it and then rocking it back and forth to get the minimum reading. This is important, that you get the absolute minimum reading between the gauges. Here I'm going to demonstrate why you don't really want to set a dial bore gauge on a set of micrometers. You see, I've set the 2-inch standard in that 2-inch mic, and it's indeed reading 2 inches right on the line. So now I'm going to come down to the 1 3/4 setting, which is a stack of our gauge blocks, and set the micrometer as close as I can to 1 3/4, and you know, tension the brake so that it doesn't move. And you can see it's, I don't know if you can see that very well, but it's right on the line, 1 3/4. This is the way a lot of people do it, and it's sort of accepted practice, but I don't care to do it this way, and you're going to see why in just a second here. So I'm trying to do this in front of the video camera. It's kind of hard to do it this way because you normally have that micrometer probably sitting in a little micrometer clamp on the bench. But see, right there, it's reading a 1/2 thousandth too small. The bigger the micrometer, the more error this is going to have, because a micrometer is designed that when you tension either the ratchet or the friction thimble, as you rotate it, that it actually flexes the frame a small amount to get the actual size reading it reads. So if you want to work to tolerances that are, you know, less than 1/1000th of an inch, this is not the best way to set a dial bore gauge. If you're working to bigger tolerances, it probably doesn't matter, but you know, if you're trying to hold tenths of 1/1000th, you're not going to get it this way. You can see it's reading at least a 1/2 thousandth undersized because the frame of the micrometer is relaxed, and a micrometer is not designed to measure that way. And I'll even verify that again. I'll go back to my gauge block stack to see that indeed the dial indicator is set on 0 on the appropriate gauge block stack. So you can see there's a 1 inch and a 3/4 inch gauge block there. And you saw I rang them together properly, and I set it originally to 0 there. And you'll see here it's still reading 0. So that micrometer actually reads a 1/2 thousandth undersized, even though the dial is set to 1 3/4 on the micrometer, when it's in its relaxed state, when it's not actually measuring over something, because a micrometer is designed to flex.